issues raised. Were there any other issues that you just didn't think of, and that as soon as the law went into effect, they started popping up?
Yeah, I would say that the thing that we really had not thought about, I mean, maybe we should have, but it's a learning experience. I think the biggest thing in terms of unexpected issues has been, leading up to, when we passed the legislation, leading up to implementation, law enforcement remained relatively neutral. They did not in any way oppose this bill. Certainly a lot of prosecutors thought it was a fairer way to do things. Like there really was, bipartisan support for this bill, and also, a situation where you had groups like mine, like Drug Policy Alliance and the ACLU, being aligned with the Attorney General's office, where often we're not aligned on issues. So there was a lot of support. And then when the law went live, there is a cultural situation on the ground that exists where law enforcement is used to being able to arrest someone. And because we didn't have a 48-hour rule, because a lot of people who were poor ended up sitting in jail, now we do have people who within 48 hours are back out and pending trial, which of course is the whole point of the law, and it is as it should be in the United States of America. But I think law enforcement was used to a system where they could lock someone up and they stayed locked up until their trial. At some point they would plead and get time served or whatever. And so I think there's been some frustration with law enforcement about arresting people and seeing them released. That requires some continued education and outreach, but we had not really thought about that moving forward. And we've even had the mayor in Jersey City has expressed some concerns about this, and a few legislators. And I think so far we've been successful at explaining this system, and not just, it's helpful not just for us, but obviously, our Attorney General's office has been very helpful in explaining, this is the way criminal justice works. You get a sentence when you've been convicted. When and if you've been convicted, you don't serve a sentence just because you've been accused of a crime. And so, but it has been interesting, and it's also been something that the bail industry has taken advantage of. I mean, they have a couple different websites now, and they post things every day, and some of the things they post are just really the police blotter. So and so was arrested with 10 bags of heroin, free to go. Well, yeah, you're free to go until your day in court, but again, it's one of those sort of things that can sound bad to the general public and that you need to do some education on. So if there's a lesson learned, I would say to people to do that education, as much as you can ahead of time so people understand this.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you about the bail bonding industry because I know that they were very opposed to these efforts when the law was being proposed, and they fought as hard as they could to prevent the law from going into effect. But so you talked a little bit about what they're doing now. That sounds kind of tame, though, just basically, talking about what's going on in the courts. Have they tried to exploit in any kind of way?
Oh yeah, I mean, it's not really tame in the sense that, legislators, get worried about this kind of bad media attention. And there's still a lot of concern. I mean, crime rates are at 30, 40-year lows, and we have in the country had a shift on criminal justice. Well, at least at the state level, we're having some backsliding at the federal level. But this is still something legislators are sensitive to, and so you listing just a bunch of people that were arrested for breaking into someone's house or stealing, so whatever it would be, and released, even though it makes no sense and it's as things should be in terms of a system, and the person's been determined with a validated evidence-based assessment that they're going to show up for court and they're not going to commit a new crime, it's still something legislators worry about. And I think it's something that, they have taken. There was one case of someone where there was a murder by someone who had been released pending trial, which could and have and did happen under money bail. I mean, there's no 100% risk-free system, but they've exploited that fairly successfully. We know they've, taken that story out to California and places like that, to try and, deter reforms in those places. And, there's also a couple pieces of legislation that would gut bail reform in New Jersey that would basically put money bail first as the option, reinstate that. And, they've tried to move that legislation, and they've had a couple hearings. So far, we've been successful at keeping that from going very far. But, that's there, and, they simply they haven't given up. I mean, and they're just, beating this drum of, oh, this is a disaster. And, if they can get a local police chief in some city to say, oh, no, I don't like this, that means a lot to legislators. And so, there is this pushback. And I think we recently saw our administrative office of the courts and our attorney general tweaked their guidelines a bit in terms of gun cases and when someone's released pending trial or detained on a gun charge. And that's been the piece that's come up most. And, part of that was to address the concern that some elected officials were, expressing, because that's been the thing that I would say that the bail industry has focused on most. Oh, people arrested, with a gun and released. Although someone arrested with a gun, and released could be a very low risk individual. It could be somebody who is not, harmed anyone, was just, not allowed to have a gun for whatever reason, didn't legally possess it, and those charges should be evaluated the same way any other charge is evaluated. But, they're out there exploiting that stuff. And I think the key thing is, they're exploiting it not just to try and roll this back in New Jersey. They're exploiting it to say it's a cautionary tale of what other states shouldn't do because things are in their, framing, have gone so wrong here in New Jersey, even though that's far, far from the truth.
Yeah. Okay. Now you mentioned the media as well. So what's the coverage been like, both good and bad, as far as what the media has been, how the media has been covering this?
We're very happy with the media so far. I think we did so much education, and there was so much coverage in the 2 years leading up to getting the bill passed, and in the 2 years, that the court was ramping up this program, that the media here is very educated on this issue, whether it's the ed boards or individual reporters. And so they've been very fair about the issue. Sometimes they have to report things, if you have, the mayor of Jersey City, as we have, expressing concerns about people with guns being released, pre-trial. That's something they have to report, but I don't think it's been sensationalized. And the ed boards have been very careful. They've continued. We had several really strong editorials that, picked apart the bail industry arguments and pointed out that, they are untrue and how well the system is going. I think we'll be better at pushing back on that once we get to 6-7 months where we begin to have data on failures to appear and new offenses that are committed while people are on release, because then we can push back with data. I mean, they're just using any anecdote and exploiting it in sort of very much a Willie Horton type of way. And so I think once that comes out, we can push back even more in terms of the media and in terms of having good news about, what's going on.
Yeah, and you mentioned data. I was just going to ask you about data too. So you're obviously going to be looking at things like failure to appear and new criminal activity and release rates and so forth. Are you going to be able to match all that up by risk level to be able to say, these are how it plays out?
We hope to. We should be able to. The advantage that we have here in New Jersey is because we have this centralized data system. And one of the pieces that happened in New Jersey when we passed bail reform, at the same time we passed an e-court bill. It was part of bail reform, and they got some money for this. So we really have really good electronic reporting now in New Jersey, and that's been something that's rolled out out over the last 2 years. So this should all be tied together as it is, because it had to be tied together in terms of doing the risk assessment and things like that, just in terms of the pretrial system. So we are cautiously optimistic that we'll be able to get that and really, like I say, dig down to that level and look at these pieces more closely.
Okay, another question came in, and let me remind folks, please, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat box so we make sure that we get them in. But this next question was there any research done on the bail bonding outcomes before the new law took effect, so that you can say, okay, before, this percentage of people out on bonds were being rearrested on new offenses, this percentage were failing to appear. Was that data being collected at all?
That is a great question. At least some of it was collected. This was before the e-court system, so it's not clear how centralized all of that is. Some of it is definitely centralized. I would point people to, there were 2 reports done by, we have a New Jersey Commission on Investigation, which does various types of investigations on different situations in the state, and they did 2 reports on the bail industry in New Jersey that were fortuitously released while we were in the midst of fighting for bail reform. And they point out, cases where people who were released, did commit new offenses. They also point out things, one of the things the bail industry always talks about is that they're on the hook for money if people, don't show up. So they have this interest in making sure people show up in court. And, one of the things these reports show is, actually what they do in our counties is settle for pennies on a dollar when somebody doesn't show up. So they're not on the hook for, they're like $6 million. If somebody doesn't show up, they settle for pennies on dollar, which begs the question of why the counties would do that. I would be like, give me the money. But so some of that is out there. It's not clear at this point how much of a comparison we'll be able to make, but we should have at least some way to compare that.
Okay. Now, another question has just come in. So you talked about, you have the risk assessment, there's common risk assessment, the PSA tool, right? What about the supervision? What's that look like? And how is the supervision set up in New Jersey?
Our court system is very clear to say that they're really not supervising people, they're monitoring people. There's 2 levels of monitoring, which really goes to, how often you check in, and that's usually by phone, with a pretrial service officer. Because we don't have the kind of money that, say, DC has, we simply don't have the ability to do that kind of supervision. Certainly individual pretrial service officers could try and, direct people, towards some health care or, some drug treatment or things like that. But there's not dedicated money for that the way there is in, say, DC or in the federal system. So it's really monitoring at this point and making sure the person comes back to court.
Okay, another question.
And we do have, I will also say, we have electronic monitoring for some individuals. So, it's reporting, and then the higher level of monitoring includes electronic monitoring.
And are these conditions set by the judge or by the pretrial services? By the judge.
They're recommended by the pretrial services unit, but then it's up to the judge to set those.
Yeah, okay. Well, that was the question here. Does New Jersey utilize electronic monitoring? Oh, for alcohol, home detention, GPS. So is it, what do you know anything about the electronic monitoring?
It's ankle bracelets is basically what it is. What we know at this point, and again, this was only with 3 months data, we know that there's some counties like Essex County, which is where Newark is situated, that are asking for ankle monitoring at a much, much higher level than some other counties. So I think there needs to be some education that happens there about, when you should ask for that. I think that's something we're going to look for, moving forward. But it's basically the kind of electronic monitoring you'd get with a bracelet.
Okay. Now, you being a statewide system, you didn't have a whole lot of different models to look to around the country because most pretrial services are county-based. There obviously is Kentucky. which has been operating for many, many years now. Were you looking to Kentucky when you started to see how they were doing things and see what you could borrow from them?
Absolutely. One of the first people that PJI put us in touch with was Tara Blair down in Kentucky, who is the head of pretrial services for the state of Kentucky, and who is originally from New Jersey. So
So
she
am I.
got
So
Yes, it's a small world.
yes.
And so we talked to her early on, and we had her come up here, and she met with our judges, and she met with our AOC folks. She testified before the legislature a couple times to talk about their system. I think, the biggest questions we had, even though their system is, a little different, was, how many people have high levels of monitoring. I think it was a comfort to people to know that in the whole state of Kentucky, I mean, first of all, their system only costs about, I think it's now 15 million a year. Back then it was 12 million a year. So it did not have to be prohibitively expensive, and that they weren't doing things like home visits and these kinds of things, that you can have successful monitoring and have people appear in court and not commit new offenses, with really lower level monitoring, which is what we have just because we don't have the money for that. And so I think, having her come up and having her being a state official with, again, solid numbers and a budget, who could say, this is how the situation plays out in Kentucky, was a huge help to us. And so we definitely look to them for that.
So now that New Jersey's in the category of a statewide system, other jurisdictions are going to be looking to you, just as you look to Kentucky. I know you don't have a whole lot of experience yet in the implementation, but you certainly do in the planning part of it. So if another state was trying to do the same thing New Jersey is doing, what advice would you give them about as far as the planning process? What are your lessons learned, things that you would say, I wish we had done it differently, or we did this and it really worked well for us?
In terms of the planning, again, I think having some time, I think, especially, depending on what your law is, if you have something that isn't as all encompassing as our change was, I think you may need 2 years to really ramp that up effectively. I think bringing in experts, I know that, again, our folks in our court system, they went down to DC, they went to Kentucky, they went to a couple other jurisdictions, they talked to the federal folks here in New Jersey to pick their brains. One of the things I hope moving forward that New Jersey does indeed, our systems folks become a resource for people in other states who ask these things. And they did. They went to the experts. They saw how things work. Of course, we have Marie Van Nostrand, who did our report originally, and then became under contract to Arnold, who did the risk assessment and did a lot of the education. So if you can get Marie involved in any way, I think that has been key here for us in making sure things rolled out well, and that we got a good risk assessment. Because I think, one of the key things is that, as we all know, not all risk assessments are created equal. And I think having the best risk assessment is really key to how well things played out. And also in getting people to understand, because there's lots of misinformation out there about risk assessments. So being able to explain what this is, and that it is, why it's a good validated risk assessment, I think is key in terms of moving things forward. And in terms of, I think, getting buy-in from the community and advocates. I think, there has been some bad media coverage about a risk assessment that's being used in Florida that, I don't think is a good risk assessment and is not being used for what it should be used for, but that has a huge number of factors and has been shown to have a disparate racial impact. And so we got a lot of calls about that when that report came out, and I think we were able to address those concerns here in New Jersey, and from, other folks in other states who reached out to us by saying, that's not the risk assessment we use, and you're absolutely right. You need a good validated risk assessment, and you'll have to continue to validate it. That's what we're doing here in New Jersey. It will continue to be validated as we move forward, to make sure that, it continues not to have disparate racial impact, and that it really is a good indicator of risk in terms of making a pretrial release decision. Oh, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. I'm having some construction being done here, so I'm trying to get that noise out. Anybody else have any other questions for Roseanne before we let her go? This has been great. Yeah, one thing that you did have in your favor in New Jersey, too, you had high-level support of this. The governor and the chief justice in particular were from the very beginning very supportive of this and continue to be so to this day. So that's very important as well.
Yeah, that was key. I will say the governor was more interested in preventative detention.
Right.
But that was fine because we were able to leverage that to get a holistic reform. And yeah, our Chief Justice, Stuart Rabner, has just been wonderful all through this process. After we released our report back in 2013, he immediately spoke out and said he wanted to look into this, and he created his own task force of systems folks to look into this and, you know, to make recommendations. And the recommendations that his task force made were fortunately the same we were making in terms of changing the system, but it was a huge help that he was willing to step up on this. And he's really been, in terms of defending the system and speaking out, he's had some great op-eds and spoken, you know, in different states about, you know, defending the program from bail industry attacks and, you know, making sure that the Rules Commission that put together the rules was, you know, really fair and balanced, and, you know, lots and lots of credit there. We were very, very lucky to have such a great Chief Justice, for sure.
Yeah, I was actually at a meeting a couple weeks ago where the Chief Justice was there saying all those things that you just said. It was very impressive. Okay, well, I don't see any other questions, and we got a few minutes left, but we're close to the end of the time. Any concluding thoughts that you have for us, Roseanne?
Yeah, I just, you know, to put the offer out there, if anyone wants to call us, you know, at any time. We fielded a lot of calls from states around the country, whether it's advocates or sometimes systems people, you know, asking us how we got the legislation passed, how we were successful in getting good legislation, how we're working on implementation. And, you know, we were very lucky in our process to have the support of folks like PJI and people in Kentucky who, you know, helped us. And so we're, you know, here to be a resource if anybody needs help on this, because this is such a critical issue. Obviously, I'm preaching to the choir, but it does have the potential to be transformational as it has here in New Jersey. So happy to help anybody else who's working on this.
Good. In fact, I just see a note here saying that Missouri may be contacting you soon. So.
Absolutely. Do you want to, should I give folks my email?
Sure. Yes.
Phone? Our phone number here is 609-396-8613. And if you want to email me, it's rscotti, R-S-C-O-T-T-I @drugpolicy.org.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Roseanne, and we certainly appreciate you spending some time with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.